Booker T. Washington, born April 5th, 1856. He was an American educator, author, and also he had an advisory role when it came to presidency of the United States. From 1890 to 1915, Booker T. Washington was the dominant leader in the African American community. He was one of the last black African American leaders that was actually born into slavery. Also, he led former slaves and their elders to bettering themselves and education during a time when Jim Crow laws were being enacted throughout the southern states. Mr. Washington is well known for his Atlanta Compromise, which we will discuss later in further detail, but it basically called for avoiding confrontation over segregation and instead focusing more on education and economic advancement within the black community, which many African American supporters and groups actually followed his ideals and this compromise until later on into the next century, which we will definitely talk about later. His base, or should I say his place of study and advancement, the Tuskegee Institute was a historical black college in Alabama. It was created around 1895, and it was actually founded by a white philanthropist, um, supporters who were also among middle-class blacks, and church leaders, and even politicians. Mr. Washington spent a lot of time gathering the fundings and the support system he needed to mobilize an institute that could facilitate the educational resources needed for African Americans, which is why he is actually one of the most influential leaders in his century. Mr. President and gentlemen of the Board of Directors and citizens, one-third of the population of the South is of the Negro race. No enterprise seeking the material, civil, or moral welfare of this section can disregard this element of our population and reach the highest success. I but convey to you, Mr. President and Directors, the sentiment of the masses of my race, when I say that in no way have the value and manhood of the American Negro been more fittingly, generously recognized than by the manager of this magnificent exposition at every stage of its progress. It is a recognition that will do more to cement the friendship of two races than any occurrence since the dawn of freedom. Booker T. Washington, September 18th, 1895. Booker T. Washington presented this speech at the exposition in Atlanta in front of an audience that was predominantly white at the Cotton States and International Exposition. Supporters were worried that though he was an influential figure, his speech would not be well received due to the fact that it actually addressed social inequality in its appearance. This speech laid the foundation to what's called now the Atlanta Compromise, an agreement between African American leaders and Southern white leaders in which Southern blacks would work and basically follow suit to political rule, while the Southern whites also in turn allowed blacks to receive basic education and due process of the law. Many factions who would actually make up later, the NAACP disagreed initially with the speech, but did conform and go along with it till later on in the next century. Due to the fact that this speech made Booker T. Washington famous, it gained him supporters and also supported the funding that he would need for his future university, which I will talk about. Booker T. Washington used the Tuskegee facilities to teach blacks the skills that they would need to bring back to their rural communities, contribute to the overall growth of the South. The goal was not to necessarily make farmers or tradesmen, but rather teachers of farming and teachers of trades who wanted to actually teach in other schools around the South. Over time, the schools expanded, departments grew, and there were professors joining who shared his same vision. He believed that if African Americans provided the skills needed to contribute to the overall growth of their country, that they would eventually be accepted by the whites. And this was the educational plan he utilized throughout his time as president until his death in 1915. He actually had grown about 1.5 million in fundings alone. With these fundings, he was actually able to establish more and more programs, which is why the college is what it is today. And again, a lot of this is thanks to Julius Rosenwald from Chicago. He really helped construct and contributed to a lot of the operations that actually built the actual schools themselves for blacks in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Without his person's contribution, the school definitely would not be what it is today.